Gary Gilmore. I've used this before, but I think it's always interesting. Gary Gilmore murdered 2 people in Utah, and he was sentenced to death for his crimes. However, throughout most of the 1970s, the death penalty was deemed unconstitutional in the United States. Not long after Gilmore's sentencing, the Supreme Court ruled essentially that the death penalty was in fact constitutional, and Gary Gilmore was soon after executed by firing squad in the state of Utah. When he was asked if he had any last words, here is what Gilmore said. Let's do it. Let's do it. So inspired by Gilmore's last words, the Wieden and Kennedy advertising agency unleashed a slogan on the American public 10 years later that became one of the best known taglines in history, and you see it as the title of the lesson tonight, Just Do It. And just do it is a call to action, is it not? It's a saying that means sitting on the sidelines and wishing that you were in the game isn't good enough. It means that you are not simply ready to do something, but you are more than ready, that you are actively working to get something done. And so in our text this evening, we're going to see Paul's desire for God's people to be more than ready. Through the message of Scripture, we can hear Paul almost say, just do it. Look with me in chapter 9, 2 Corinthians, beginning in verse number 1, we'll read through the first 5 verses and then spend the rest of our time working to unpack this. God's word says, "Now it is superfluous for me to write to you about the ministry for the saints, for I know your readiness, of which I boast about you to the people of Macedonia, saying that Achaia has been ready since last year, and your zeal has stirred up most of them. But I am sending the brothers so that our boasting about you may not prove empty in this matter, so that you may be ready as I said you would be. Otherwise, if some Macedonians come with me and find that you are not ready, we would be humiliated, to say nothing of you for being so confident. So I thought it necessary to urge the brothers to go on ahead to you and arrange in advance for the gift you have promised, so that it may be ready as a willing gift, not as an exaction." We see that the verses that we're studying this evening are in a new chapter. However, you need to realize that they are dealing with the exact same topic that we've been dealing with all the way through chapter 8. Chapter 9 is therefore not a change of subject from what Paul was teaching on in the previous chapter. And we know this. Why? Because Paul uses a logical explanatory conjunction. It's the Greek word gar, and it's actually, if you look, you'll see it translated as the word now in English, which, by the way, I think it's a poor translation to translate gar in this sense as now. Most of the time, it's translated as for. And at the beginning of the verse, its placement at the beginning of the verse, it really tells us that he is now, again, explaining something that he had already been laying out in the previous section. And so he also talks in verse number 1 about this ministry for the saints. You see that? And you know then that it's the same thing that he was talking about in chapter 8, which is this collection that he was trying to receive for the saints in Jerusalem. We know it's a reference to that offering because there were struggling saints, there were suffering saints, suffering believers in Jerusalem. We also know that the church in Corinth had begun to collect an offering before the fellowship with Paul was interrupted as a result of the infiltration of the super apostles into the fellowship. These men worked to actively drive a wedge between the believers in Corinth and the apostle who planted the church. And so you have to remember what Paul wrote at the end of 1 Corinthians. You can actually turn there if you want. Keep your place in 2 Corinthians. Turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 16, and you'll see what I'm talking about. What he's dealing with in chapters 8 and 9 was nothing new to the believers there in Corinth. They had already been familiar with this. You see it in verse number 1. of chapter 16 in 1 Corinthians. Now concerning the collection for the saints in Jerusalem, as I directed the churches of Galatia, so you also are to do on the first day of every week. Each of you is to put something aside and store it up as he may prosper, so there will be no collecting when I come. Look at verse 3. And when I arrive, I will send those whom you accredit by letter to carry your gift to Jerusalem. If it seems advisable that I should go also, they will accompany me. Now, there's something I need you to pay attention to, because this is going to come back into focus as we work our way through the text. He says you're to put it aside on the first day of every week, and the purpose for putting it aside, you see it there in verse 2, so that there will be no collecting when I come. So when I come, I don't want to have to do the collecting while I'm there. I want the collecting to be done before I get there. Now hold on to that. Go back to 2 Corinthians chapter 9. As we go back there, we begin to understand that Paul's focus in this section of the letter is not then to introduce a new initiative of any kind. It's not to convince the Corinthian believers to support a new initiative with generous financial donations. Instead, he's imploring them to resume the collection and to finish what had already begun. Look back at chapter 8. We see this, and just by way of review, in verses 10 and 11. And Paul says what? He says, and in this matter, meaning this offering, I give my judgment, this benefits you, who a year ago, notice that a year ago, started not only to do this work, but also to desire to do it. So now finish doing it as well, so that your readiness in desiring it may be matched by your completing it out of what you have. So what is happening now is Paul is consistently and repeatedly calling upon them to finish what they had already committed to do. And that brings us to something that is all too familiar in life. And that is the fact that people often get very excited about something and then fail to follow through on their commitment. Have any experience with that in your life? People get excited about something and then fail to follow through with their commitment. You know, we saw that in the One Vision campaign, which was our effort to raise finances to be able to essentially remodel the entire building. Some of you only know Cross Point as it looks today. But before we went into this project, this building was laid out very differently. The worship center is still in the same place, and that's it. Everything else is completely different. Everything else is completely rearranged. This whole area was not this classroom, and there are doors where doors didn't used to be, and there are no windows where there used to be windows. And I mean, everything is, the main entrance is totally different than where it used to be. Everything is completely different than it used to be. And so we had to raise funds to be able to do this. It was extremely expensive to knock everything except the worship center down to studs, and in some places take out the studs, reroute. I can't even begin to imagine how many feet or yards of electrical wiring and plumbing. And I mean, those of you who were here during the process, you remember walking in and the floors were cut up and the concrete was trenched out and there was gravel, and it was crazy. The restrooms didn't used to be, I mean, right there, and they were, but not really. It was crazy. It took a lot of money. Took a lot of time, took a lot of effort, so we decided to start a campaign to raise funds to be able to do this and to make the building more friendly and usable for ministry today and into the future. And when we first started talking about it, people had some reservations. They were understandably hesitant because it was a lot of money and we weren't adding a ton of extra space. But yet we really were, and I could go into all of that if you ever wanted to ask me about it. I still remember all of the stuff that accomplished, and I will tell you this, that while we didn't really add a lot of space to the building, we changed the footprint in such a way that we can handle more people than we ever could before, which actually worked out extremely well. But people were hesitant. Then we began to move into a capital campaign phase where we talked to people and asked people to give generously and to give sacrificially over 3 years to help us make the vision a reality. And people committed initially, and then some recommitted themselves after a year to give even more. And eventually we received considerably more than what was pledged and promised. However, there were those who were at one time all in for the project, but ended up leaving the church before the commitment was fulfilled, and they did not finish what they started. They were excited, but they didn't follow through. And this issue moves beyond life in the church. How many people approach marriage with great enthusiasm, only to walk away from the marriage after just a few years? How many people enthusiastically anticipate the arrival of a baby, only to abandon that child when they get tired of being responsible for the child's life? It's easy to get excited about an opportunity or a need when it's presented. Now, let's face it, some people are really, really good at getting others interested and even enthusiastic about their cause. When we did the One Vision thing, there was something I didn't even realize. There's a whole industry of people who are trained to go into churches and get everybody ginned up about giving. I'm like, well, this is amazing, right? And we didn't know what we were doing, so we hired one of them. And then they gave us materials, and I'm like, no, we're not going to do that. That doesn't really fit who we are. Is there a bomb about to go off that I don't know about? I hear a beeping. Phyllis, are you beeping? You don't hear it? There you go. Okay, good. No one's been able to stop it? Oh. We can help you, dear. We have like teenagers who can take that and do it in a heartbeat.
I can't hear it.
You can't hear it? Well, that's okay. I didn't know it was you. I thought something was about to happen.
My daughter's not in here, is she?
No, you'd have heard from her already. She would have been like, turn it off.
Thank you.
No, you're good. I'm like, what is that? And why is it going on? There are people who are very, very good at getting others interested and enthusiastic, but it's another thing entirely to do whatever it takes to follow through with your commitment when the enthusiasm wears off. And believe me, at some point, the enthusiasm will, in fact, wear off. The Scripture is clear on this issue. God's people must follow through on their commitments. In other words, the Bible doesn't give any of us the opportunity or excuse to walk away from commitments. And so we cannot fail to fulfill, first of all, our commitments to God. Ecclesiastes 5, verses 4 and 5, when you vow a vow to God, do not delay in paying it, for he has no pleasure in fools. Pay what you vow. It is better that you should not vow than you should vow and not pay. Numbers chapter 30, verse 2, if a man vows a vow to the Lord or swears an oath to bind himself by a pledge, he shall not break his word. He shall do according to all that proceeds out of his mouth. And so we cannot fail to fulfill our commitments to God. We cannot fail to follow through on our commitments to others. In Psalm 15:4, the Bible says, he who swears to his own hurt and does not change. It lauds that person. Why? What's it saying? It's saying, okay, I promise I'm going to do this, and even if it costs me dearly, even if it costs me physically, even if it costs me financially, I'm going to follow through with what I said I would do. Jesus warned against this in the context of becoming a disciple, but it also has a broader application. Listen to what he taught. For which of you desiring to build a tower does not first sit down and count the cost, whether he has enough to complete it? Otherwise, when he has laid a foundation and is not able to finish, all who see it begin to mock him, saying, this man began to build and was not able to finish it. And Jesus is saying, no one does that. No one should be doing that. You should consider before you make a commitment whether or not you're willing to follow through all the way to the end, if you have the means to follow through all the way to the end. In Galatians, Paul set the standard when he encouraged believers to not grow weary of well-doing. Sometimes doing the right thing is hard and becomes harder when the enthusiasm for doing that thing wears off. But what do? You continue doing it. You don't get tired, you don't get weary, you don't stop doing it because you might not feel like it any longer or because it gets that much harder. Do you see the point? We live in a culture that gets excited about everything but follows through with nothing. And this must not be true of us. We, as God's people, must be known for faithfulness. We must be known for doing what we said we would do, even if it ends up costing us personally in the long run. So here's the message of this text. Faithfulness requires more than enthusiasm. Faithfulness requires more than enthusiasm. I'm not saying that faithfulness doesn't require enthusiasm. Certainly there is an enthusiasm that we're going to see at the outset. But it's not enthusiasm that carries you through to completion. It's faithfulness. It's honoring a commitment. It's the mentality that I said I was going to do it, and so I'm going to do it, no matter what it costs me, no matter how long it takes, no matter how hard it is. We've already seen that the believers in Corinth enthusiastically supported the offering. We're going to look at that again here in just a moment. But Paul was, in this text, dealing with the fact that their initial enthusiasm wore off. And when the enthusiasm was gone, so was their desire to follow through with their commitment. How do we know that? Because they hadn't done it yet. And that left the most important thing, which was the offering, undone, unfinished, uncompleted, unrealized. And so as we think about how this relates to us, you need to realize that Paul isn't just talking about money. All right, so you need to look at this with a bigger lens. You need to expand your bandwidth here so that you understand that while the initial context is, of course, money, they promised to do something and they hadn't done it yet, they hadn't followed through with it, there's something bigger at stake here. There's something more behind what Paul is saying in this text. What he is dealing with really is the integrity of believers. You said you were going to do it, but you haven't. You said you were going to do it, you must do it. And I hope I'll be able to prove that to you from the text as we work through it. Paul is here questioning whether the Corinthians will be faithful to the commitment they had made after the feeling they once had faded. And here's the thing. Enthusiasm is easy. Enthusiasm's easy. If somebody is good and convincing, they can make you enthusiastic about just about anything. Right? If a salesman is really, really, really good, a car salesman is really, really, really good at his job, that car salesman can make you enthusiastic about going $50,000, $60,000, $70,000 in debt for something that will rust and be gone in 15 years. Right? If he's good, he can make you enthusiastic about it. It's not hard to become enthused and excited about things. Enthusiasm is easy. Faithfulness is costly. Faithfulness is costly. And some of you have made commitments to give, to serve, to lead, to disciple, to reconcile a relationship, to pursue holiness, to fight sin, to invest in your marriage, to shepherd your children, to stay planted in the life of this church. And at one point, you meant every word of it. The question is not whether you meant it then. The question is, will you finish it now? Will you work through to completion? So this passage really does force us to ask three important questions. The first is this: are my commitments reliable? Are my commitments reliable? When I tell somebody I'm going to do something, am I going to follow through? Number two, does my follow through strengthen or weaken the testimony of Christ? And then number three, would others be confident boasting about my faithfulness? Not in a sinful way, but would others be confident in boasting about my faithfulness? You know, so-and-so, the thing about that person is this: if he tells you he's going to do something, he'll do it. If she tells you she's going to do something, she'll do it. If they tell you they're going to be there, they're there. No questions asked. And if for some reason they're not, then something tragic has happened. Because you can just rely on them. Listen, if your commitment only lasts as long as your excitement, then your commitment is no commitment at all. But if your commitment continues after the emotion fades, that is the mark of faithfulness. And so our study tonight it really does call on us to be the kind of believers whose word can be trusted, whose commitments are completed, whose readiness reflects genuine conviction and not just external pressure. Because Christ is honored when faithfulness is demonstrated. So that's why all this matters. That's why you need to pay attention to what God's word has for us this evening. So let's dive in to the word together, and we're going to see really two valuable truths about enthusiasm tonight. The first is this: enthusiasm responds to the need and provides motivation to act. As we look at these first two verses of chapter 9, that is really the thing that we see in what Paul is saying. Enthusiasm responds to the need and provides motivation to act. So what is Paul doing here? Well, you'll notice that Paul acknowledged that it was unnecessary. The word superfluous here, it can mean unnecessary. It can also have the idea of redundant. I know that you already know this, and so with me telling you this again, it's not really necessary that I use my words to put this back in your head, because I know you already know it. I'm confident you already know this. It's somewhat redundant. It's repeated. I get that. And so Paul recognizes here it's unnecessary, it's unneeded, it's redundant to write to the believers in Corinth specifically about the offering. Now, Paul is not saying that everything that he writes in this section, that all of it is redundant. Okay? That's not what he's saying. He's saying, as it relates to this offering, I know that you know about this. I get it. I'm not a dummy. I'm not acting like you have no idea what this is. I know you know about this. And how do we know that? Now it is superfluous, or for it is superfluous, for me to write to you, and here we have it, about what? The ministry for the saints. This is the offering that was being received. He was fully aware that they were completely aware of the need, and they had actually, according to Paul in verse 2, they had actually expressed a readiness, an eagerness, an enthusiasm to give to the Christians in Jerusalem. We had already read chapter 8, verse 10, but if you look in verse 2 of chapter 9, you see that they had known about this, that they had been ready, that they had been eager, that they had been enthused about doing this since last year. So about a year has gone by since Paul first put to them the idea of collecting an offering for the saints in Jerusalem. A year has gone by since they expressed evidently overwhelming enthusiasm and excitement to be part of it. And Paul says, okay, a year's gone by. I know you know about this. I realize that your desire to help meet the need of the saints in Jerusalem was expressed really as a reflection of gratitude for God's saving grace, which we see in chapter 8, verses 1, and again in verse number 9. So what you have to see is Paul here is not questioning their readiness. Paul is not questioning their enthusiasm. He's agreeing with it. He's affirming it. I know. It's redundant for me to even talk about it. That's how aware of it he was. But what you may not know is that Paul actually used the enthusiasm, the readiness of the believers in Corinth to inspire the believers in Macedonia to give to the same cause. And what do we know about the believers in Macedonia from chapter 8? They were poor, right? They had no money whatsoever. They were beyond impoverished. So there's poor and then there's poor, right? Or there was poor and there's po and I can't afford the R, right? Is what some people say. And so there's levels of poverty. They were in extreme poverty. So that's one of the things we know about them. What else do we know about the church of Macedonia, the believers of Macedonia? They were giving. That despite their impoverished condition, they gave. And how does Scripture in chapter 8 describe their giving? Yeah, to their own loss. They gave above what they could even afford to give, right? They gave cheerfully, obviously. They gave liberally. They gave in a way that would make people like us stand up, take notice, and say, wow, how in the world did they do that? And evidently, there were others who were asking the same question. That's why Paul answers that question. How were they able to give so liberally, being in such a state of poverty? And Paul says what? They gave because they first gave themselves to the Lord. That's what motivated them to do that. So here's what Paul did. He goes to the believers in Corinth. He says, hey, the believers in Jerusalem are suffering because of the gospel. They believe the gospel. They've been ostracized. They've been kicked out of their homes. They've lost their jobs. They don't have money to eat. They're suffering drastically right now for the cause of Christ and because of the gospel. And the believers at Corinth said, we should do something to help. And Paul says, okay, let's take an offering and we'll take it back to Jerusalem. And man, they're all in, excited, enthusiastic. They can't pull out their wallets fast enough, right? They're ready to go. So then Paul then goes to the churches in Macedonia and says, hey, let me tell you what happened down in Achaia, right? Achaia is simply, it's Corinth and the surrounding region. If you go to 2 Corinthians chapter 1, you realize, I think it's in verse 1 or 2, that Paul says that he's writing to the saints in Corinth and the saints of Achaia. So he has the whole region in mind. And so he goes to Macedonia and says, these people, listen to what they're going to do. And the Macedonians said, we want to do that too. Can we? And remember what it says about the believers of Macedonia. They begged to be part of it. Right? So there must have been some give and take here. Maybe Paul was saying, listen, guys, you're poor. You have nothing. There's no way you can afford to be part of this. Paul, please let us be part of this. If the Corinthians are doing it, we want in. Okay? So Paul took the enthusiasm of the Corinthians to inspire enthusiasm in the Macedonians. How do we know that? Look at the text. For I know, verse 2, your readiness, of which I boast. That is, he boasts and continues to boast about you, Corinthians, to the people of Macedonia, saying that Achaia has been ready to give since last year. And look, and your zeal, your enthusiasm, your readiness, has stirred up, it is provoked, it is challenged most of the people, the believers in Macedonia. The phrase stirred up there is interesting because it simply means to stir someone to action as if by challenging them to a contest. Now, I don't think Paul did this at all, so I don't want to take a lot of liberty here, obviously. But it would almost be like, if you've ever tried to motivate your children to do something, right? Child A, I don't want to name names because I have children and I don't want them to think I'm talking about them. Child A, child B got an A in math and you got a B. I bet you can't beat them. Did anyone ever do that with the kids, or was it only us? Okay, that's uncomfortable laughter. Sorry. Let's so-and-so cleaned their room faster than you. I bet you can't do it faster than them. Oh, okay. So it's kind of this spurring on. It's provoking. It's invoking an excitement, enthusiasm to do something good and right. That's what that word stirred up means. It means that Paul boasted about the people of Corinth and this offering so much to the Macedonians that it provoked them, it challenged them, and they accepted the challenge, and they were willing then to give, and then they gave. But what you need to see in this text is really two different kinds of readiness. Okay? There is a readiness of intention, and that is exactly what had been expressed when he used this to provoke the Macedonians to give liberally to meet the need. And then he celebrated their eagerness in this readiness of intention. But there's also a readiness of completion. And this is the issue that Paul wrote to address. you can have all the eagerness in the world, but if there's not a real intention to follow through, then what does that eagerness do for you? For example, let's say you go to the doctor and the doctor tells you that you have to have a surgical procedure done, and maybe there's a certain pain that you're dealing with or a certain issue that you're dealing with, and the doctor diagnoses, okay, this procedure is going to help alleviate this pain in your life. And so it's might be a minor procedure, might not be a minor procedure, but after he tells you, it makes sense, and you're like, okay, that makes sense, and now you become enthusiastically anxious to get the surgery done. Why? Because you're tired of living in pain, and he tells you that this is going to eliminate the pain that you've been living with for a while. And so, man, you go through the planning process, you tell others about what you're having done, and then you show up at the appointed time for the surgery. But listen, you can have all the intentions in the world, but if you don't lay on the bed and allow the surgeon to do the procedure, you never move from being ready to have the operation to having the operation completed. And really, this is what Paul's addressing here. He celebrated their enthusiasm. Enthusiasm's good. He used it to motivate others to participate. Good. But they had not yet followed through and done what they said they were going to do. As you think through this, you begin to realize that enthusiasm can be a grace of God. Right? It's a gift of God to be excited about the things of God. It's a grace of God that we get excited about good things, right things. But enthusiasm is not the same thing as maturity. Their readiness flowed from grace, but their desire to give, while it was not insincere, it was gospel-produced gratitude, certainly. But as you think through it, true Christian desires begin always in the heart. God's saving grace produces in us a willingness, and Scripture distinguishes between intention and perseverance. And the thing about it is, initial zeal is not the same thing as spiritual maturity. And so you may feel stirred in a moment of conviction, but that stirring must always be anchored in a settled conviction, because it's the conviction that will help you follow through. So I ask you, are your commitments rooted in emotion, or are they rooted in truth? Think about your life. Where has your enthusiasm run out? How many of you on January 1st received an email from the church? If you're a member of Crosspoint, all of you should have received it, and it had a 90-day Bible reading plan in there. Read through the Psalms in 90 days. And man, you saw that and you were enthused about it. You looked at the plan Monday through Friday. It's not a ton of reading, but it takes you all the way through the Psalms in the first 90 days of the year. And here we are on September 11th. February. I'm just skipping all the way over to the next football season. Here we are. What month is it? February. Okay, February. Here you're on February 11th. And you're like, I'm not enthusiastic about reading the Psalms anymore. Matter of fact, when the year started, I was doing it 5 days a week. And now I'm down to one, maybe. See the difference? Where's your enthusiasm run out? Where has the readiness of intention not become the readiness of completion? Where have you confused eagerness with obedience or faithfulness? These are things we all struggle with. These are all things that we look at what Paul is addressing here with the Corinthians, and we don't have to wonder what that's like, because we all know to some level or another what it's like, because we all struggle to some degree with this. It's part of being a human being. It's part of growing as a follower of Jesus Christ. It's part of the process of sanctification. Enthusiasm may recognize the need, obviously, but unless it leads to action, nothing actually gets done, and that leads us to the second truth that we need to see. Enthusiasm must lead to keeping your commitments. Enthusiasm must lead to keeping your commitments. Notice, starting in verse number 3, there is a shift, okay? And Paul now moves from affirmation. You were enthusiastic. That's good. Your enthusiasm was used to motivate other believers to do the right thing. That's good. So we have an affirmation really in verses 1 and 2. And then you see verse 3, and you have the English word translated, but it's a continuative conjunction. It's intended specifically to signal a shift from one thing to another. What's the one thing? It is recognizing their readiness and shifting to urging them to follow through. So Paul moves from affirmation to action. And in doing so, he explains exactly why he's sending the brothers. Now, who are these brothers? Well, we know Titus is one of them. This is from chapter 8, verses 16 through the end of the chapter. Titus, one of his sons in the ministry, is one of them. And he goes on at length about Titus and Titus's character. And then there is a preacher who is famous in the churches for preaching the gospel. He's a man who evidently was a brother of high character, a quality believer, a mature believer who was coming with Titus. And then there was another guy who is unnamed as well, and he also had a stellar reputation as being an upright, honest, truthful servant of the Lord. And these three men were being dispatched by Paul, being sent by Paul ahead of Paul's visit. Paul was still intending to visit them, and he was telling them now in this section why specifically he's sending them. So in the end of chapter 8, he was saying, I'm sending them. Now he's saying, I want you to know without any question or confusion why these men are coming to you. They're coming for a specific purpose. They're coming on a clear mission. He didn't want them to be confused or miss the meaning of their purpose in Corinth. And how do we know that? Well, let me just walk you through a couple things. In chapter 3, I am sending the brothers. Look at the next two English words, so that. Okay? Whenever you see a so that, not all the time, but the majority of the time in the New Testament, it is what is known as a hina clause in the Greek. The hina clause simply is a statement of purpose. Okay? So when you see so that, you know that the next thing coming is Paul saying, this is the purpose. I'm sending them to you. Here's why. Okay? Now, you'll notice that there is a hina clause at the first part of verse 3, but you'll also notice that there is a hina clause in the back half of verse 3. So in verse 3, there are two of these clauses. So that our boasting about you may not prove empty in this matter, so that you may be ready as I said you would be. So Paul is explaining, okay, I'm going to tell you why I'm sending these brothers, and I'm going to tell you why it's important that that you don't prove me empty in this matter. Okay? And by the way, I'm going to get to it in just a minute, but if you're marking things up in your Bible, which is a good thing to do, if you drop down to verse number 5, you're going to see a third hina clause in the text. So Paul is just spending a lot of time explaining things and making things clear to them. So let's pull apart the first one here. But I am sending, he's made the decision in the past to send these believers. It's an active thing. He's dispatching them, these brothers, so that our boasting about you may not prove empty in this matter. What specifically is he talking about boasting about them for? Does that make sense? Yeah. Well, not completing it. Being willing to, yes, being willing to give an offering, right? To participate in this offering. That's what Paul's been boasting about. The Corinthians, look what they're going to do. Macedonians, to the Corinthians, look what the Macedonians have done, right? And so now he's coming along and he's saying, I'm sending these brothers so that our boasting about you may not prove empty in this matter. Let me just kind of explain what Paul is saying here as clear as I possibly can. Paul did not want his boasting to be proven meaningless. I've been telling the Macedonians about your eagerness. and as eager as you have acted, surely you would have followed through. So you know what? Don't make my boasting, Paul uses this word often in his letters. The idea is bragging, but not in a prideful, not in a self-glorifying kind of way, right? Pro athletes boast all the time. They score a touchdown. They point to the name on the back of the jersey, right? They make sure everybody knows who made the big play and those types of things. That's not what Paul is doing here. Paul's boasting was in them because they were doing the right thing, because they desired to do the right thing. So it's a right kind of boasting. But he's saying, listen, I don't want them, the Macedonians, or really anybody else to whom we've boasted about you, to see my boasting as meaningless. So what is Paul expressing here? He's expressing the reality that his boasting was tied to his credibility, and their actions are tied to his credibility. It was about his credibility and also the credibility of the believers at Corinth. Now, verse 4, I'm going to skip down to verse 4, and it tells us what is at stake. You don't have to wonder what's at stake. He spells it out here for us. Because he says, if some Macedonians travel with me, okay, I've told them about you. They've done an incredible thing because they gave themselves first to the Lord. And when I tell them I'm headed down to Corinth, there may be some Macedonians that say, we want to see this church. I mean, Paul, you've boasted, you've bragged about them. And you've told us about their enthusiasm. You've told us how ready they were to be part of this. You've explained, and we want to see this with our own eyes. So we want to come with you. And Paul says, so what happens if I bring some Macedonians with me? Oh, by the way, these Macedonians who are really, really poor and sacrificed greatly to give to this offering, and I bring them with me because they were motivated and moved and inspired by what you said you were going to do, and we come into town and you haven't done any of it. What effect would that have? What effect would that have on me? Paul says, what? We would be humiliated. Do you know what the word means? It means to be put to shame. We would be put to shame. It would be such a humiliation, such an embarrassment to me, to these other believers who travel with me, who also have boasted about you. Notice when he says boasting, he talks about our boasting. So Paul wasn't the only one boasting. The people who traveled with him and who were familiar with this and who had witnessed the readiness, the eagerness of the Corinthians initially, they went to Macedonia and they joined Paul in the boasting. Oh, Paul's right. Paul's absolutely right. Man, you should have seen how excited they were. You should have seen how enthusiastic, how ready they were just to throw money at us so that we could take it back to the believers in Jerusalem. Paul's saying it would be humiliation. It would be humiliating for me. It would be humiliating. It would be shameful for the people who have boasted alongside of me. We would be humiliated. And then notice what he says, to say nothing of you. You also would be put to shame. You also would be humiliated. And here's why we would be humiliated, because we were so confident in you, and our confidence was completely unfounded. You had enthusiasm, you had excitement, you had intentions, but you had no faithfulness, and you had no follow-through. And that would be a shame on me, and it would be a shame on you. Their unfinished commitment would expose them all as frauds. Paul is not messing around here. Did you notice that? It's one of the things I love about Paul is sometimes he's so unbelievably blunt. He does it with the tenderness of a pastor's heart, obviously, but yet he's just laying it out there and saying, here's what's on the line, so that you're not confused. This is what's at stake. My credibility, the credibility of the team who travels with me, and even, Corinthians, your credibility. Because if this happens, if we show up and you haven't done what you said you were going to do, then our word and your word means absolutely nothing. That's what Paul's saying. So, jump back up into verse 3. So he's sending them, the brothers, so that you, Corinthians, may be ready. Meaning that they would avoid such an embarrassing situation. And the only way to avoid being embarrassed by not following through is to be made ready. Paul wanted them to act on the desire they had. This desire that was implanted in their hearts, it's a perfect tense verb, meaning the focus with the perfect tense, you've heard me say this before, but the focus with the perfect tense is always not on the initial action, but it's the ongoing result of the initial action. So the initial action is we have a desire. The ongoing result of that desire is the fulfillment of it. Does that make sense? And it's in the language, it's passive. So in other words, they've been moved to do this. They've been acted upon to do this. So the mission of the brothers was to prepare them so that everything Paul said about the Corinthians would, in fact, be proven true. It would be kind of like someone who announces publicly they're going to run a marathon. They go out and they buy the shoes and they download the training app. They tell their friends that they're going to do it. They post on social media about the day of the marathon and what their plans are, but then they never consistently train for the marathon. And when race day arrives, all of the enthusiasm in the world will not carry them to complete a 26.2-mile run. Preparation proves whether their commitment is real. And Paul is saying here, basically, Corinthians, race day is coming. I've told others you're running. Now you've got to prepare for it. Paul believed it was necessary then to urge the brothers and sisters to go, or these brothers to go and prepare them to do exactly what they had promised. Down in verse 5, you see, I thought it was necessary. I considered, I reckoned in my mind that it was absolutely necessary. Now he moves from the language of redundancy to the language of necessity. It was necessary to urge, to entreat the brothers, these three, to go on ahead to the Corinthians and to prepare, to arrange in advance for the gift, the blessing that you all had promised in the past, so that it may be ready. Now notice, and let me just point this out to you, okay? So look up in verse number 3, you have the second hina clause, so that you may be ready. Drop down in verse number 5, so that it may be ready. The only way that it will be ready is if you are ready. Do you see that? They're coming to prepare you so that it, the offering, the gift, the blessing that you have promised will be ready. What Paul is saying here is the money's not going to give itself. The money's not just going to appear. No, you have to have a part in it. It's not enough for you to be enthused about it, but you've got to prepare yourself by doing all the things that are necessary so that when I come, the offering, will be there. And we will avoid all of this embarrassment and shame that would happen if all you had was a desire but no follow-through. So this gift, this blessing, must be ready when Paul arrives. And now Paul explains why this is important, okay? So that it, the offering, may be ready as a willing gift and not as an exaction. I had to study this, had to look at it for a little while, and let me just kind of walk you through what I believe Paul is saying here. Paul wanted to make sure that by the money having already been given before he gets there, that they gave it with willing hearts. They gave it with open hands. They gave it because they wanted to follow through with the enthusiasm that they once had for this offering. But Paul is saying, if you wait until I get here, if you wait till I come, then I'm concerned that the only reason you will give is because you felt like I twisted your arm to do it. Paul's saying, I want the desire to come from a willing heart and open hand, not because it has been extracted from grudging and stingy hearts. Paul wants the offering to be a generous gift, not funds Paul and the others need to extort from them, forcing them to give up. Really, if you look at this word exaction, the idea is forcing somebody to give up what they want to keep because of their own covetous hearts. They just want to hold on to it. It's mine. I don't want to give it up, but because Paul's here, so what is Paul doing here? He's trying to protect them. He's trying to protect them, make sure that they're giving with the right heart and attitude, because the heart means more in giving than the amount means. Believe it or not. So think back to chapter 16 in 1 Corinthians. And remember Paul's instructions. I told you back then, hold on to it, because we're going to see it again. What did Paul say? Lay aside the first day of every week so that when I come, there will not have to be a collection. See it? Paul's saying, I already told you this. I already made this clear. And you didn't follow my instructions then. So I'm sending some folks to you to try to encourage you and to teach you, to shepherd you, to disciple you, so that you see what's at stake here. It's not really about the money. It's about you being the kind of people who follow through and do what you promised to do. Paul's always looking at the heart, because in the believer's life, the heart makes all the difference. And believers are to reflect the heart of God. We're told in 1 Corinthians that we are to mimic, that we are to imitate the Father as dear children. You know what that means, right? When my son especially was young, there were times where he would mimic me. I can't remember which one it was. I don't know if it was Jordan or Evan. I can't remember which one, but we actually have a picture. And I'm out in the backyard when we lived in Michigan mowing the grass. I think it was Evan. I think it was you. And Evan has this little toy lawnmower, right? So I'm pushing the lawnmower, and right behind me is Evan with his little toy lawnmower. Just pushing it right behind me. What was he doing? He was imitating me. Why? Because I'm his father. And what I know, and I think is so unbelievably great, is as he gets older, he will do more and more things like I do it, and he will say more and more things like I say it. Why? Because I raised him, and one of these days he's going to stop. Men, you know what I'm talking about, and he's going to be like, oh my gosh, I'm my dad. And I'm going, yes. Because I've had that same moment where I've been like, oh, I'm my dad. That's the way it works. Paul says, be imitators. Mimic the behavior of your Father, who is God in heaven. So if that's true, Ephesians 5, or 4, I'm sorry, believers then are to reflect the heart of God. He's not a God of intentions. He is a God of fulfillment. He didn't intend to send his son to the cross. He sent his son to the cross. He didn't intend to raise his son from the dead for our justification. He raised his son from the dead. He didn't intend to save those who call upon the name of the Lord. No, he saved you when you called on the name of the Lord. What kind of people should we be? We must be those who do what the Father does. God is not a God of intentions. He's a God of fulfillment. What he promises, he accomplishes. What he begins, he completes. He who began a good work in you is faithful to what? Complete it. You know, a watching world may not care what you feel, but it does notice whether or not you follow through. So do other believers. And what does that tell us? It tells us good intentions are never enough. Preparation and completion are required. And so is there a gap between what you've said and what you've done? Here's how you respond, brothers and sisters. You ask the Lord to expose areas where your readiness has not led to faithfulness. So if you committed to give it. If you committed to serve, show up. One of the biggest areas, one of the biggest points of frustration that every ministry leader in this church has, every single one of them, whether it's Harmony, who leads our Kid Point ministries, it's Owen, who leads our media ministries, it's Pastor Nate, who leads our music and worship ministries, Bryn, who leads our greeting ministry. You name the ministry. One of the biggest points of frustration we have is people who enthusiastically say, I'll serve. And then we schedule them. And then they're not there. Well, who do you think's going to do it if you're not there? Seriously, do you think people are just going to pop up out of the ground and say, I'll do it? No. And what happens? Now we're trying to find other people. And it's like, oh, well, I know you served the last 7 weeks in a row, but we really need you to serve again. Or in the case of this past week, we had to shut down an entire class because we didn't have people to help. It makes a difference. I know things happen. I know people get sick. We're in sickness time of year. I know people take vacations. I don't begrudge any of those things. But listen, if anywhere there is a place, if there's a place anywhere on earth where people are scheduled to serve and show up, it ought to be the church, because we ought to be people who don't just intend to do it, but follow through, even if it costs us, even if it's hard. If you commit to disciple somebody, set the meeting. If you commit to reconcile with someone, make the call. Obedience must be willing. It can't be extracted. Finish always what you start, not reluctantly, but deliberately. Enthusiasm, it may start the commitment, but preparation and perseverance always prove its sincerity. And so, let me ask you this question. If someone were to boast about your faithfulness the way Paul boasted about the Corinthians, would you feel confident or would you be concerned? If you heard somebody talking about you, boasting about your faithfulness, your intentions, the way Paul was boasting about the intentions of the Corinthians, would you go to that person and say, thank you so much? Just pray for me that God will always allow me to fulfill the things that he's given me to do? Or would you go to them and say, please stop that? Please don't. And it's not a humility thing. It's just that you know you're not going to follow through with it. At the end of the day, the text confronts us with a simple but powerful and heart-searching truth. God is not impressed with our enthusiasm. He is honored by our faithfulness. And the Corinthians were eager, they were vocal, they were well-intentioned, but Paul here presses them to prove their sincerity by completing what they had promised. The same is true for us. Our integrity as believers, our testimony before others, the honor of Christ's name, they're all tied to whether we finish what we start. So here's the thing. Don't be satisfied with just admiring the need. Don't stop at expressing readiness. Prepare and follow through. Let your yes remain yes. Because when God's people do what they said they would do, willingly and faithfully, Christ is glorified. So in the words of Nike, just do it.